Sulfur God, the one-eyed god, one half of Almer, the Ascended One, is an evil and mysterious entity, and perhaps one of the darkest gods in the world of fear and hunger. Even though he appears in only a few brief frames in Fear and Hunger Termina, Sulfur God still leaves us with many questions. So today, we'll analyze the mysteries surrounding the Sulfur God, from his identity, origins, to his role in the world of fear and hunger. This video will be quite analysis heavy. I'll try to explain these concepts as clearly as possible, but I should say in advance that some parts will be a little dense, so you'll need to focus to follow along. I also need to emphasize that everything I'm about to present is limited by my own research and personal interpretation. There will certainly be shortcomings, and not everything should be treated as an absolute conclusion. But if you watch until the end of the video, I believe you'll understand the message I want to convey through the story of Sulfur God. Sometimes, imperfection doesn't destroy perfection. It is the rejection of imperfection that creates a monster. That's enough of an intro. Let's begin. To understand the Sulfur God, we have to begin with the figure most directly connected to him, Almer, the Ascended One. Since I already have separate lore analysis videos about this god, we won't go too deeply into Almer's lore in this video. However, you still need some basic information about him to follow the later discussion of the Sulfur God. So let's briefly go over the basics. Almer is an ascended god with a human origin. His story is directly inspired by Jesus, and the parallels are almost too obvious. He was conceived through the seed of a false god and born to a virgin woman in a holy city. He gathered 12 apostles and preached the unification of all thoughts under one shared house. He was executed by kings and sultans and crucified on the cross. He died and returned 3 days later in Mahabharata, and afterward, he became the center of a major religion. However, Almer isn't entirely like Jesus. He is more like a darker version, or, as the community jokingly calls him, an evil version of Jesus. After returning from Mahabharata, Almer didn't bring salvation. He was blinded by his quest for revenge. He gathered the remaining 11 apostles. Together with his army, Almer massacred the kings and sultans of that time, who were essentially the new gods ruling the world. In doing so, he broke the new order built by the new gods and opened the way for a new one. But what is unusual is that, at its core, the new order Almer created was very similar to the old order that once belonged to the old gods. In other words, this wasn't an entirely new order, but something more like a new old order, an old order restored in a new form. This detail reveals a very close connection between Almer and the old gods. Almer's blindness, driven by hatred, is shown most clearly in the teachings of Almer. It states, "An eye for an eye leads to everyone being blind. But when everyone involved is already blind, there is very little to lose. Blind in your quest for power, I am blind in my quest for vengeance." This line echoes a famous quote often attributed to Mahatma Gandhi. "An eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind." Its meaning is clear. It condemns revenge. Responding to violence with violence ultimately creates only a cycle of suffering in which no one truly wins, and everyone becomes blind in some sense. But there is something very strange about Almer's line. Almer seems fully aware that his actions are driven by hatred, blindness, and a desire for revenge. Yet he can no longer wants to control himself. He allows that very blindness to guide his actions. This leads me to a theory. Something changed inside Almer after he returned from death. Something emerged within him and influenced his actions afterward, even though his consciousness still recognized that what he was doing was wrong. This may be precisely what caused Ulmer to gradually stray from the path of a savior and move toward the image of a far more tyrannical ruler. One reason I have some confidence in this theory is that, while he was still human, Ulmer seemed to possess very benevolent and noble qualities. This is shown in his sermons and in the reverence people held for him, especially in the Eastern sanctuaries, where Ulmer was said to have been born. Artists from the Eastern sanctuaries often emphasized Ulmer's mortal origin. In their portraits, he is depicted as a slender man with long hair and facial features that remain distinctly human. Several spells associated with Ulmer are also very noteworthy. Opening spatial gates, walking on water, turning water into wine, and multiplying bread. Clearly, these powers are directly connected to the miracles of Jesus. But here is what we need to pay attention to. In the story of Jesus, miracles such as walking on water, turning water into wine, and multiplying bread were all performed while Jesus was still living a human life on earth, before being crucified and resurrected. Therefore, if Ulmer is built within the same symbolic framework, it is possible that he also possessed these powers while he was still human. Let's pause for a moment to talk about religion and theology. In Christianity, the power of Jesus is divine power manifested through human form. Jesus was already the Son of God, then humbled himself to take on flesh. But in Gnosticism, it tells the story completely differently. Jesus doesn't perform miracles simply because a human being is granted power by God, but because he is the Savior, the Son of the Supreme God, sent down from a higher plane of existence to save humanity, which is imprisoned in the material world created by the Demiurge, an imperfect God. When viewed through the lens of Gnosticism, miracles such as walking on water, turning water into wine, and multiplying bread can be understood as signs that Christ isn't bound by the material order established by the Demiurge. Water, bread, and wine, all of these belong to a lower material plane. Christ comes from a higher plane, so he can transcend or transform the material world or reveal its non-absolute nature. Here, we can see that Ulmer's powers in the first game also have a very similar nature. They are especially tied to the ability to create matter from nothing, as well as the ability to bend space and open gates for travel. This means that Ulmer is inspired not only by Christianity, but also directly by Gnostic ideas. To make this easier to follow, the analysis above can be summarized in two main points. First, after his ascension, Ulmer seems to have undergone some change in nature. From a figure of salvation, he gradually shifted toward domination, even though he himself seems to recognize that the path of revenge is blind. Second, the powers Ulmer possessed while still in human form are an extremely unusual sign. They suggest that Ulmer's origin likely extends beyond humanity alone and conceals another mystery. And if Ulmer's origin truly lies at the intersection of Christianity and Gnosticism, then he isn't simply an ordinary human who rose to become a god. He is an entity born or sent down from a higher plane of existence, taking human form to save humanity from the material world. This is not unreasonable, especially given that Ulmer also has a second origin legend, which we'll briefly discuss next. However, before we get to that, I want to make one distinction to make things easier to follow. From now on, I'll call the version of Ulmer before his ascension, when he was still in human form, Messiah. Now, let's return to Ulmer. If the first origin legend of Ulmer is strongly influenced by Christianity, then the second carries a more theological tone. According to this legend, Sylvian, an old god, ordered Vitruvia, a divine architect, to design humanity. Using Vitruvia's blueprint, Sylvian breathed a soul into the design and created the first humans. However, over time, Vitruvia came to recognize the flaws in her own creation. Unable to accept them, she created a perfect human being, and that being was Almer. For now, we'll set aside the significance of the name Vitruvia and the story of her attempt to create a perfect human, which is clearly inspired by the Vitruvian Man, Leonardo da Vinci's famous drawing, because that detail contributes little to the main story we're discussing today. What I want you to focus on is the imperfection within Vitruvia's original blueprint for humanity. Philo, a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher, once reasoned from the phrase, "Let us make man in the book of Genesis," that God may have used other beings as assistants in the creation of humanity. He explained this in a very interesting way. Humans possess both sin and virtue because the process of creating humanity involved multiple sources. Virtue comes from God, while sin comes from those who assisted him in the work of creation. If we apply this interpretation to the story of Almer, then the source of sin, or more accurately, the imperfection of humanity, appears to originate from Vitruvia. She then tried to correct her mistake by creating a perfect human, Almer, the one who would later become the savior, the one expected to redeem the errors in humanity's original design. But here is the problem. If humanity's imperfection came from Vitruvia, the assistant involved in the work of creation, then how could she be certain that she could create Almer as a perfect human being? And how could she breathe a soul into him or bring him into the real world? More importantly, what does any of this have to do with the false god and the Virgin Mother from the first origin legend? Let's pause for a moment to address these earlier questions before moving into the next part of the analysis. First, Almer is clearly a divine creation, or at least an entity whose origin is connected to a higher plane of existence. This partly explains the unusual powers he possessed while still in his human form as Messiah. This second legend also reinforces Almer's connection to theological and Gnostic ideas, God, humanity, and the imperfections within human nature. We know that, according to Gnosticism, the supreme God sends his Son down to save humanity, the souls imprisoned within physical bodies and the material world. If you've watched my previous videos, you're probably already quite familiar with this interpretation. I've emphasized more than once that humanity in fear and hunger seems to be imprisoned within reality itself, both in soul and body, and is always trying to find a way out. Viewed in this way, that condition may stem from Vitruvia's mistake, combined with Sylvian's blind love. As for Almer, he may have been created as an attempt to correct that mistake, a perfect creation born to save this world. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not claiming outright that Almer is the son of the supreme God. I'll explain that part shortly, so bear with me a little longer. The main point I want to make here is the similarity between Almer's origin, the circumstances of his birth, and the motifs found in Gnosticism is not accidental. And that also brings us back to the question we raised earlier. How could Vitruvia, an assistant of God who seems responsible for humanity's original imperfection, be confident that Almer would become the perfect version of humanity? And ultimately, does a true supreme God exist in the universe of fear and hunger? A God who, according to this second legend, may actually be Almer's true father. Before we go deeper into Gnosticism, I need you to pay close attention, because what we're about to analyze will play an extremely important role in the central story of today's video. I've also consulted several other videos that discuss a similar topic, and I have to say that their perspectives are very interesting as well. However, Rest assured that although we may begin with some of the same references, my argument from this point onward will move in a relatively different direction. I also encourage you to watch those videos to gain additional perspectives. After all, my argument is still a theory, not something fully confirmed in canon. Even so, I'll try to present it as clearly and rigorously as I can. Let's begin. The term Gnosticism comes from ancient Greek and is associated with knowledge, understanding, or recognition. It refers to a collection of ancient religions and intellectual movements that often emphasize the need for humans to turn away from, or transcend, the material world created by the demiurge in order to move toward a higher spiritual realm. In Gnosticism, the material world isn't seen as the ultimate reality or as the perfect creation of the supreme God. Instead, it is often regarded as a lower realm tied to the matter, desire, time, and imperfection. By contrast, the realm of the supreme God is a higher one associated with the spirit, light, perfection, and eternity. It doesn't belong to the material world and is extremely difficult to perceive through the ordinary senses. In many interpretations, time also doesn't exist there in the same way it does in the material world. Therefore, to move toward the supreme God, a Gnostic must attain gnosis, meaning salvific knowledge. And this knowledge isn't simply about knowing more. It encompasses curiosity, learning the secrets of history and the cosmos, the origin of the soul, and the true structure of reality. The important point is, there is no single version of Gnosticism. Gnosticism isn't a fixed, fully unified doctrine. Rather, it is a highly diverse group of movements. The Scythian, Valentinian, and Basilidian systems, as well as texts such as the Gospel of Judas, Thomas, and the Apocryphon of John, can present the stories of Jesus, Sophia, the demiurge, and salvation in different ways. Even so, these systems still share a fairly clear general framework. At the top is a hidden and invisible supreme God who is beyond all names and is not identical to the God who created the material world. Beneath the supreme God are divine layers, sacred entities, or aeons belonging to the realm of fullness known as the pleroma. In many Gnostic myths, a deviation occurs within this divine realm, often involving Sophia, whose name means wisdom. Sophia is an aeon from the higher plane, but through a deviant act, or a desire that falls outside the proper order, she gives birth to demiurge without the consent of the supreme God, or without her consort. In the Apocryphon of John, demiurge is described as a lower entity, a malformed, ignorant, and arrogant demigod. He takes the form of a serpent with a lion's face and eyes like flashes of fire. Ashamed of him, Sophia hides him away because he was created in ignorance. She names him Yaldabaoth. But although he is malformed and inferior, Yaldabaoth still carries a portion of the power taken from his mother. He creates or rules over the material world. He declares himself the only God and creator because he knows nothing of the pleroma or the true supreme God. Let's pause for a moment. If you watched my first video about fear and hunger and berserk, you may remember this concept. In that video, I discussed the material world and the astral world, including the void and green hue. These are layers of reality that exist above the material world, with green hue as the highest layer. You can imagine it as a vast sea that continuously produces and nourishes ideas. The old gods are the greatest ideas formed within it. If we compare this structure with Gnosticism, it seems that the material world of fear and hunger did not exist from the very beginning as an ultimate reality. Instead, it was created, or at least shaped, by higher entities. The humans within it are imprisoned by the body, desire, ignorance, and imperfection. Well, we all know whose fault that is. Vitruvia. just as humans in Gnosticism must attain gnosis to move toward a higher reality and transcend the material world, humans in fear and hunger also need to reach a state of awakening known as enlightenment. This may be the state that scholars such as Nostradamus and Enki have already reached, since they followed the path of enlightenment. And when I say that with confidence, I truly mean it. Let me explain. In the game, there is an item called the Book of Enlightenment. It is described as follows. The book radiates light in every color of the spectrum. You feel as though your journey has just begun, as if your existence up to this very moment had been like watching someone else entirely. You feel a shift in your perspective of your surroundings, as though everything were shrinking, or perhaps you were ascending higher. You gain a better understanding of yourself. The link between your mind and body has begun to deteriorate. You feel closer to enlightenment. As you finish reading the book, it crumbles into dust before your very eyes. Let's temporarily set aside the direct meaning of this description, because I think it is already quite obvious. What I want you to pay closer attention to is the imagery on the pages. For a very long time, I was genuinely troubled and rather obsessed by these images. They seem to depict an entity that has never directly appeared in the game, along with a vague state or process illustrated on the right side of the page. I also researched and consulted many sources on how to interpret this page. Most people connect the image to an old god who has not appeared in the game, named Amun, the sun god. Some interpretations even suggest that the sun god is Almer, or perhaps even Grogoroth, god of destruction. In fact, this is entirely possible because the symbol of the sun god appears on the page. In addition, Grogoroth's symbol also contains a solar motif. However, something about these interpretations still leaves me unconvinced. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not completely rejecting those views. You'll understand why if you watch until the end of the video. What I'm saying is that I have a different perspective on the true meaning of these images. The first thing I want you to notice is the title of the page, Book of Enlightenment. This means that the book is describing a state of enlightenment, a state in which the self seems to rise toward a higher layer of reality while the mind, or spirit, separates from the physical body. Looking at the drawing on the right, it seems to depict the mind, or spirit, separating from the body and ascending toward higher planes of reality. Now, what about the drawing on the left? The reason I don't believe this is simply an image representing the sun god lies in the eyes. If you've watched my Bloodborne video, then you'll understand what eyes usually represent: insight, awakening, and knowledge that leads to enlightenment. If we interpret this as the sun god illuminating humanity and guiding it toward awakening, then that reading also makes sense. But I believe the story goes deeper than that. I lean toward the possibility that this image depicts a higher entity, God, the Almighty of the fear and hunger universe. A God described as omniscient and omnipotent, one who observes everything not only through his power, but also through the symbol of the all-seeing eye, the eye of God, which is often represented as an eye inside a triangle, symbolizing God's omnipotence and omniscience. Do you see it? The eyes, omniscience, and the all-seeing eye. All of these features appear in that drawing. However, this may be only a fleeting glimpse of God recorded on the page by scholars who followed the path of enlightenment. It may not represent his true form. As with the old gods, God and the other gods in fear and hunger may be ideas that transcend material reality. This could explain why the book does not directly grant the reader complete enlightenment, but instead allows them to awaken only partially. So what do the Supreme God and Demiurge have to do with the Sun God, Almer, and the Sulfur God. Demiurge is the first archon, and beneath him are angels, or lesser powers. The key point in Gnosticism is this: the Demiurge is not omniscient. He is blind to his own origin. The greatest sin of the Demiurge is not merely cruelty, but ignorant blindness. He believes himself to be the ultimate source of reality when, in truth, he is only a lower entity who cannot understand the realms above him. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Personally, I believe that the story of Sylvian and Vitruvia making a mistake by creating humanity with that imperfection and blindness likely draws direct inspiration from the story of Sophia creating the Demiurge. Sylvian and Vitruvia created humanity in a way that fell outside, or at least did not fully align with, the will of the Almighty. That is where the mistake arose. Sylvian's blind love caused humanity to sink into a dark age, and that ignorant blindness gave birth to the new gods, other versions of the Demiurge in the world of fear and hunger, beings who call themselves gods while remaining blind, unable to recognize the transcendent realms or the true gods. Recognizing that humanity had lost its way, the all-knowing one sent his son down to correct that mistake. And that is the origin of Ammon, the sun god, the king of ancient Mahabharata. Ammon, along with the other old gods, appeared in ancient times, even before humans began worshipping them. Meanwhile, many descriptions in the game emphasize that the king of Mahabharata took pleasure in creating and shaping clay statues. Even after he disappeared, those statues remained, as though waiting for their true owner to return. Based on this limited information, I cautiously put forward a rather wild theory. Ammon is the god who created the material world. It was he, together with the other 7 old gods, who took turns governing the order of this world at the dawn of time. It was Ammon who shaped the traces of the old gods, allowing them to exist in the real world. And it was also he who, after recognizing his own mistake, willingly sacrificed himself and became the light that entered the design, or vessel, created by Vitruvia. He later became Almer, the one who would bear responsibility, take on sin, and save humanity. This would explain the mysterious disappearance of the king of Mahabharata, as well as Almer's later divine powers associated with salvation and light. Let's pause for a moment. Personally, I'm not completely certain about this theory. At the moment, we don't have enough solid evidence beyond the fact that Ammon is the sun god and the king of Mahabharata. However, there is clearly an ambiguous relationship between Ammon and Almer. The most notable example is the sword of the king of Mahabharata, which was sealed alongside an angel named Heartless One. Many people believe that she is a new god. However, I lean toward the theory that Heartless One may be one of the lesser angels who once served Ammon. The evidence is that she doesn't want to be grouped with the new gods, even though she is technically still classified as one. In addition, she possesses red virtue, one of the 2 swords that once belonged to the king of Mahabharata. Not only that, but Heartless One's attacks are also connected to light and display the symbols shown on the pages of the Book of Enlightenment, which we know has a strong connection to the sun god. Why she was sealed in another dimension within the Church of Almer remains a major question. But this appears to be connected to the fact that she was sealed by her own master, or more precisely, by the other half of her master. We'll discuss this matter in greater depth later. For now, I want to explain why I place some confidence in the theory I just mentioned. To do that, I'll share some information I gathered while researching Ammon. They can also become quite confusing if you lose focus, so please pay close attention here. In the novel Lord of the Mysteries, the ancient sun god is described as the almighty and all-knowing, the source of all greatness, the beginning and the end, the god of gods, and the ruler of the vast astral world. He has 8 kings of angels who follow him. Amun is one of those kings of angels and also the son of the ancient sun god. The ancient sun god once called Amun the god of trickery, the god of deceit, and the light at the dawn of the apocalypse. In Egyptian mythology, Amun is the king of the gods, a creator and protector of cosmic order. His name is often understood as the Hidden One, or the Invisible God, because his nature is not tied to a simple, visible phenomenon such as the sun, the Nile, or the sky. He represents a hidden, invisible, and difficult to grasp power, like the wind, something that can be felt but cannot be seen. Most importantly, Amun was merged with the sun god Ra, becoming Amun-Ra, or Amun-Re. Amun represents the hidden and invisible aspect, while Ra represents the part that manifests and can be seen through the sun. Therefore, Amun-Ra becomes a god who is both invisible and visible, both the mysterious power behind the world and the light that nourishes life. In addition, in some interpretations of mythology, the sun god is connected to the moon god and can be reborn by transforming into a snake and shedding its skin. Interesting, isn't it? Well, let's temporarily set aside the detail that the sun god is almost entirely absent throughout the game, as well as the fact that Amun was merged with Ra, a name pronounced somewhat similarly to Re, the moon god in fear and hunger, who is also associated with deception and substitution. Let's also temporarily set aside the fact that one half of that symbol looks as though the sun is being hidden. I think these may simply be design inspirations that were blended together. What I want you to notice is, Amun's story has much in common with what we see in fear and hunger. Amun is the leader of the gods. Amun is connected to the sun. Amun may stand very close to the supreme god. And if we look at the clock face engraved with the symbols of the old gods in the Prehevel Museum, we can see that Amun's symbol occupies the first position. Immediately after it are 2 symbols that, according to my theory, may have split from Amun. One belongs to the Sulfur God. For now, we can call the other Algiz. If we exclude these 2 beings, which may once have been part of the original entity, only 8 old gods remain in total, with Amun standing at their head. The reason I believe the 2 symbols behind Amun belong to 2 gods split from the sun god, Sulfur and Algiz, comes from their placement. We can see that Sulfur and Algiz appear immediately after Amun's symbol, but before the symbol of Re, the moon god. Assuming that the symbols on the clock face are arranged in symmetrical yet corresponding pairs, we can identify several fairly reasonable pairings. For example, the god of the depths may be paired with a mysterious god bearing a star symbol, representing the sky or the cosmos. The god of nature may be paired with a god connected to insects. The god of destruction may be paired with a god of creation. And if this arrangement is correct, then clearly, the sun god should be positioned opposite the moon god. But here's the problem. Why are Sulfur and Algiz placed between this opposing pair? In Egyptian mythology, the moon god may have a close connection to Amun. I'm not sure whether fear and hunger directly uses this motif, but if the moon god truly has some relationship with Amun, then the placement of the moon symbol after the symbols of Sulfur and Algiz becomes quite difficult to explain. And this leads us to a very thought-provoking conclusion. Sulfur and Algiz may be 2 gods closely connected to the sun god. More specifically, they may be 2 later forms split from this very sun god. with sulfur appearing closer to the original entity. So how do Almer and the Sulfur God relate to these symbols? For a long time, I believed that the cross-like symbol belonged to Almer. But during my research, I came to realize that I may have been mistaken. Almer is identified as an ascended god, on the same level as the god of fear and hunger. His ritual circle is the perfection circle, in contrast to the old gods, who are associated with the asymmetric circle, a symbol of the asymmetry within their nature. The symbol of the god of fear and hunger is also absent from the clock because she has a human origin. If that is the case, Almer should not be placed directly within this system of old god symbols either. If we look more closely, Almer's familiar symbol has a clearly defined cross shape. Meanwhile, the symbol on the clock face is not exactly a cross. It extends slightly upward, making it resemble a rune more than a conventional cruciform symbol. So what does this character actually mean? And which god does it belong to? In the Elder Futhark alphabet used by Germanic and Viking peoples, the rune Algiz, or Elhaz, has a shape resembling a person raising both hands toward the sky, as if praying, receiving cosmic energy, or connecting with higher powers. This rune is often associated with protection, a spiritual shield, and a connection to divine power above. Coincidentally, the shape of the Algiz rune matches the symbol on the clock surprisingly closely. Its meaning is also very similar to the blessing Almer grants to those who pray to him: protection. We know that the Sulfur God is one half split from Ammon, or, more precisely, from Almer after Ammon was reborn in human form and underwent ascension. But if Almer was split, then the remaining part can no longer be the whole Almer. Viewed in this way, Algiz may be that other half, the protective part, the salvific part, the part reaching upward toward the sky, opposed to sulfur, the part of hatred, violence, and fire smoldering beneath the earth. However, this raises another question. What caused Almer to separate himself into two different beings? And what was the true reason behind that act? Before moving on to the next argument, I'll briefly summarize what we've covered so far so that the amount of information doesn't become confusing. Please keep in mind that this is the lore viewed from a theological and symbolic perspective. I haven't yet combined it too deeply with the actual stories told or passed down within the game. The reason is quite simple. Those details do not directly serve the purpose of this video, and introducing them too early would make the discussion very confusing. In addition, as the creator himself once said, most stories about the gods in fear and hunger are passed down orally and recorded from many different perspectives. Therefore, no version is entirely right or entirely wrong. And this fits very well with the theme running throughout today's video. There is no absolute light, and there is no absolute darkness. You'll understand more clearly what I mean by the end of the video. For now, let's go back and summarize everything we've discussed so far. In my view, the lore of Almer and the Sulfur God is heavily influenced by Gnosticism. We have the existence of a supreme God, an all-knowing and almighty being, connected to eyes, illumination, awakening, and enlightenment. The Almighty may be the ancient sun god, or the entity who gave birth to Ammon, the sun god. Ammon therefore became the king of the gods. Together with the other 7 old gods, he formed corresponding pairs of opposites, shaped the universe, and later shaped the physical world as well. In the beginning, these gods resided in the void, or true Mahabre, and ruled the material world together. Sylvian, the old god of creation, created humankind with the help of a lesser angel named Vitruvia. because humanity was designed under the influence of one of the 8 supreme beings. Humans were originally children who carried divine light. But because of Vitruvia's imperfections, humanity also inherited many flaws. Humans could not respond to Sylvian's love in the way she expected, and they gradually lost their way. Sylvian's blind and somewhat selfish love, together with Vitruvia's mistake, unintentionally caused humanity to become imprisoned in the material world and trapped in a dark age. Humans gradually lost their direction, became blind, lost faith, stopped recognizing the presence of the beings above, and slowly lost their connection to higher layers of reality. The Almighty was not pleased with this, so he sent his child, Amon, the sun god, directly into the real world to correct that mistake. Amon's mission was to guide humanity toward enlightenment and help the spirit of the species transcend the bonds of the body, the soul, and the material world. Meanwhile, the Almighty commanded the remaining old gods to withdraw and return to the void. He also established a rule: no old god would be allowed to return and directly interfere with humanity's development again. Ammon volunteered to become a seed of light. This seed would serve as the divine soul, while Vitruvia's design would serve as the body, the physical form prepared for Almer's later ascension. To make this easier to understand, let's temporarily call the seed that Ammon became the soul of light. The soul of light was later planted by a false god within a virgin woman, whom we'll temporarily call Maria. From there, the seed was born in human form as Messiah. Although Messiah had a human body, the soul of Ammon, the god of light, slept deep within him, waiting for the right conditions to awaken into godhood. Messiah was born from a mixture of Christianity and Gnosticism. Because of that, his lore is told in 2 different ways, depending on the perspective of each tradition. The truth may be that all of those versions are correct in some sense. Then everything happened as we know it. Messiah was arrested, crucified, killed, and that death gave the seed of light an opportunity to sprout and merge with the body in true Mahabra. Afterward, he ascended and became Almer. But Almer returned in a very different form. Blinded by revenge, he tried to restore the old order, the order of the age once ruled by the old gods. Although he still seemed aware that his actions were blind and that he had strayed from the original path of salvation, Almer no longer appeared to be fully in control of himself, because he had become another version of himself. This is somewhat similar to how the god of fear and hunger, after being reborn, fully acknowledges all of humanity's suffering. When a human becomes a god, they are not only elevated, they are also transformed by the entire meaning, memory, and nature they represent. After that, for some reason, Almer decided to split his soul into 2 halves. Those halves became 2 new gods. One was Algiz, and the other was the Sulfur God. The Sulfur God was cast down into the sulfur pits. Algiz also disappeared afterward for some mysterious reason. That is why the king of Mahabra disappeared. That is also why the sun god has such an ambiguous connection to Almer. And that is why Vitruvia's design could become Almer and then appear in the real world. It also explains why certain details suggest that Almer may actually have existed long before he was born in the form of a seed. Okay, we'll temporarily end the summary here and return to the question: what caused Almer to split himself into 2 different beings? And what was the true reason behind that act? In my view, even after the process of ascension, Almer was still not truly whole. He remained in a stage of polishing, a state of moving toward completion, without having fully reached it. It seems that all of his actions, although nominally carried out for humanity, still contained a profound inner conflict. That conflict is what stained Almer's path of salvation with blood and hatred. Within the motifs of Christianity and Gnosticism, his mission should have been to save, enlighten, and guide humanity onto the correct path, not to rely so completely on violence. Even in his later teachings and blessings, we can see this polarity very clearly. On one side, there is blood, hatred, and violence. On the other, there is blessing, salvation, and forgiveness. Even before being divided into two halves, Almer already carried a deep conflict within himself. And in my view, this is one of the reasons that drove him to separate himself in an attempt to resolve it. However, I'm sorry to say that this is only the tip of the iceberg. The cause of Almer's separation was actually influenced by many other factors. Two of them are psychology and alchemy. To keep things from becoming confusing, I'll peel back each layer one at a time. First, we need to understand the cause of Almer's violent, bloody, and destructive behavior after his ascension. To find the answer, we need to return to the way Vitruvia created the design for Almer, the perfect human being. We all know that the human design was shaped by Vitruvia according to Sylvian's will. In that sense, Sylvian can be considered Almer's mother. This is further reinforced by both versions of the skin Bible of Venushka, the god of nature, and the child born from Sylvian. Both versions emphasize that Almer and Venushka are equals because they suckled from the same mother's breast. The nature of humanity is also similar to nature itself. It can be violent and destructive, but it can also be peaceful and fertile. What is noteworthy is that Venushka was born from the union of Sylvian and Grogoroth, the god of destruction. So it is easy to understand why Venushka possesses both sides, fertility and destruction. But here is the difficult part. If Almer simply has Sylvian as his mother, then how could he be placed on the same level as Venushka in this way? Clearly, Almer also carries two sides within himself, much like the god of nature, one violent and one gentle, one destructive and one salvific. And this leads me to a theory. Almer wasn't simply born from Sylvian. Grogoroth was also involved. Don't misunderstand me. Amen, the sun god, is still the child of the supreme god, as I mentioned earlier. He only later serves as the divine soul of Almer. As for the one who truly gave birth to Almer, or more precisely, the one who planted Amon's seed within Maria, the virgin woman who gave birth to him, in my view, it was none other than Grogoroth. Let me explain further. The identity of the false god, the one called a god walking amongst men, has many characteristics that match what is described about Grogoroth in studies of Grogoroth. He is portrayed as a curious god who wears human skin, walks among humanity, and constantly observes the species. In addition, the original skin Bible of Venushka mentions that Venushka's seed was incubated or fermented by Grogoroth for millennia. If we compare this with the implication that Venushka and Almer are equals, we arrive at a very thought-provoking conclusion. Grogoroth may be the false god responsible for incubating Amon's seed within his body before transferring it into Maria. The fact that Amon's seed was incubated by Grogoroth for millennia may have caused it to partially absorb the aspects that Grogoroth represents: blood, violence, destruction, and transformation. Put simply, Grogoroth is, in a certain sense, the father of Almer. And this would explain many of the theories we'll raise later. Let's pause here for a moment. While writing this script, I came up with several different theories about the true identity of the false god who brought Amon's seed into Maria. Two possibilities are Vitruvia and Heartless One. In my view, Both could be considered lesser angels of the old gods and could temporarily be grouped with the new gods or false gods because of their limited power. As for Heartless One, I once thought that she might have been a close angel of Ammon, entrusted with part of his power, and then given the task of bringing his soul into the real world to be reborn. As for Vitruvia, the lore is clearer. Perhaps after recognizing the flaws in the original design, Vitruvia redrew it and added the aspect of Grogoroth, the opposing pole of Sylvian, in order to create a perfect balance. After that, she sent the design down into the real world. All things considered, both theories seem reasonable. However, they are still not as complete as the Grogoroth theory. So, for now, let's treat them as side theories worth considering. Besides that, I once proposed an even wilder theory about Grogoroth's true identity. Perhaps he also carries another identity, namely, the Almighty of the Fear and Hunger universe. I know this sounds a little ridiculous, but there are a few unusual details about Grogoroth and the Almighty that make this theory difficult to dismiss. The first is the eyes. We know that the Almighty is often associated with the symbol of eyes. And during the second phase of the fight against the trace of Grogoroth, we see many eyes seemingly trying to crawl out from beneath the shell of Grogoroth's body. If we consider the motif of hiding or concealing one's true self behind many layers of shells in order to observe, then perhaps the form we fight is not this god's true form. This brings us to the statue believed to represent Grogoroth, shaped like a large man and placed directly in the center of the square in Mahabre. At first, I also believed the theory that Grogoroth was the sun god, or the king of Mahabre. However, if we think more carefully and consider the father and son relationship between the Almighty and Ammon, the sun god, as well as the relationship between Grogoroth and Almer, I think this statue may have been placed there to honor the Almighty, the father of the king who vanished from Mahabre, meaning the sun god. Not only that, but Grogoroth's eclipse symbol is also worth considering. In the Bible and Islamic records, eclipses are often associated with the end of days, and the darkening of the sky can be seen as a warning of supreme power, as well as a sign of the Creator's presence. If Grogoroth is truly the supreme god hiding behind the shell of the god of destruction, that would also explain many details that appear later. For example, why does Grogoroth possess the power to incubate seeds and give birth to old gods such as Venushka? Because this is fundamentally the power of a creator. And Venushka may not have been the only being he created in this way. Perhaps, from the very beginning, he had already done the same thing when bringing Ammon, the sun god, into existence. Moreover, the fact that he is called a false god may imply the nature hidden behind his many shells, a true god appearing in a false form. However, please keep in mind that this is still only my theory. Personally, I'm not completely confident in this interpretation either, even though it makes sense in many ways. So, for now, we should not assert it as fact. Let's treat it as an interesting point of reference to keep in mind throughout the analysis. Now, let's return to the main story. Because of Grogoroth's influence, part of Almer carries aspects of blood and violence. This may explain his brutal revenge after the soul of light belonging to Aemon awakens. At this point, Almer resembles a new version of the sun god, a god of light and hope, but one who is not entirely pure. He retains the consciousness of forgiveness, protection, and salvation that Messiah possessed while he was human. Yet he also carries the blood, fire, and violence of the soul of light, that originally belonged to Ammon, along with the influence of Grogoroth from the period when that seed was being incubated and transformed. It seems that Ammon's soul overwhelmed the spirit of Messiah and buried that part deep within the subconscious. This allowed the dominant aspect of Almer, or more precisely, the part that would later become the Sulfur God, to take control. At that point, Almer became blind in his quest for revenge, a journey steeped in violence. But deep within him, the Messiah part still recognized that this was a deviation, a form of blindness, even though both parts may still have been moving toward the same destination, the salvation of humanity. Recognizing the conflict and imperfection within himself, the Sulfur God, who still existed within the identity of Almer at that time, decided to split himself in two once again. The purpose may have been to remove the opposing part and thereby reach a more perfect state. But that very act later led to the birth of two new gods, the Sulfur God and Algiz. That sounds quite confusing, doesn't it? Let me simplify it. After his ascension, Almer still had not reached a perfect state. Within him existed a conflict between Sulfur, the soul of the sun god, infected by blood, fire, and destruction, and Algiz, the spirit of Messiah, representing protection, forgiveness, and salvation. The Sulfur part was dominant. It believed that, for Almer to reach a perfect state, the remaining part had to be erased. So it split Almer into two halves. From there, the Sulfur God and Algiz were born. But here is the problem. Why was the Sulfur God himself, the one who was dominant at that moment, ultimately overcome by the weaker half and cast down into the sulfur pits? What exactly happened when Almer split himself in two at Mahabharata? To answer those questions, we need to examine a particularly important character, one who may have directly influenced the event of Almer's ascension, Black Kalev. Black Kalev is a relatively mysterious character. He has an ambiguous connection to Grogoroth, from the fact that he appears in the form of a horned goat, an image that often evokes demons or Satan, to the fact that his true form is described as an unusually large man. To some extent, these descriptions match the way Grogoroth is depicted in the texts. In my previous lore analysis video about Almer, I proposed the theory that Black Kalev is Grogoroth in disguise. He may also be Messiah's 12th disciple, the one who, according to the original lore, was said to have betrayed Messiah and caused his later execution on the cross. This theory becomes even more noteworthy when Black Kalev reveals that he stood beside Almer at the moment the Ascended One split himself into two beings. And if we consider that Almer divided himself in true Mahabharata, or the void, a place where, as we know, only higher beings and gods can exist, then Black Kalev is clearly not an ordinary person. In Christianity, Judas was one of the 12 apostles of Jesus. He is remembered throughout history as the betrayer, the one who handed his teacher over to the Roman authorities in exchange for 30 pieces of silver. That act directly led to Jesus being arrested and crucified. However, as mentioned earlier, the lore of Almer is not only inspired by Christianity, but is also strongly intertwined with Gnosticism. So the story goes beyond the conventional image of Judas as a betrayer. This reversed perspective is shown most clearly in the Gospel of Judas, an ancient text from the 2nd century that was rediscovered in 1970. In this text, Jesus privately asks Judas to hand him over to the authorities. The act of betrayal is no longer betrayal in the usual sense, but an act of sacrifice. Judas helps Jesus break free from the shell of the physical body so that his soul can be liberated and return to the kingdom of light. While the other 11 apostles are described as ignorant, worshiping the mistaken creator God and failing to understand the true nature of Jesus, Judas is the only one chosen. Jesus takes Judas aside and teaches him the highest secrets of the universe and creation. He says to Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." According to this Gnostic reading, Judas had to bear an extremely bitter fate. Jesus also foretold that Judas would be cursed by future generations, regarded as a traitor, and forced to endure endless bitterness. But in the end, he would be honored in the divine spiritual kingdom. So, if the story of Judas in fear and hunger is also strongly influenced by Gnosticism, then Messiah may well have been aware of his true divine self. His execution on the cross, rather than being merely a tragedy, may actually have been part of a plan arranged in advance by him and the 12th disciple. The purpose was to help Messiah escape the physical body imprisoning him and return to the kingdom of light, or, in the case of fear and hunger, possibly the void or green hue. This becomes even more noteworthy because the game contains several statues and items depicting a snake with the face of Almer or Sulfur being crucified on a cross. This detail is rich in both alchemical and psychological symbolism, so please pay close attention to what I'm about to explain. In alchemy, the snake represents mercury, meaning quicksilver, a substance that is mobile, volatile, and difficult to grasp. Crucifying it on the cross symbolizes the process of fixation, transforming an unstable substance into something with form, limits, and controllability. Mercury is also one of the 3 elements of the Tria Prima, or the 3 basic elements, a foundational concept in alchemy proposed by Paracelsus. According to this system, all things are composed of 3 spiritual and material forces. Sulfur symbolizes the soul, will, fire, and desire. Mercury symbolizes spirit, life, and mobility. Salt symbolizes the body, stability, and material form. This is also the basic structure used to create the Philosopher's Stone, which represents immortality, perfection, and absolute power. We'll analyze how these 3 elements affect the process of Almer's ascension in greater depth immediately after this. For now, what I need you to notice is Mercury represents spirit, and it is highly volatile. Therefore, crucifying the snake on the cross may symbolize the fixation of this energy, holding it in a specific form and then extracting its pure essence in order to move toward the creation of the Philosopher's Stone. Carl Jung also borrowed many symbols from alchemy to explain the structure of the human psyche and the journey of individuation. In Jung's reading, this process can be understood as the journey of mastering and integrating the deeper layers of the unconscious. Primal instinct, desire, the shadow, and all the imperfect parts that humans refuse to acknowledge within themselves. Put simply, the symbol of the snake with Sulfur's face crucified on the cross may represent Sulfur undergoing a process of completion and attempting to reach a state of wholeness like the Philosopher's Stone. To accomplish this, he needs to fix Mercury, meaning spirit, the human part, or the volatile darkness within him, to prevent that part from evaporating and escaping its material form. In other words, Sulfur is trying to stop Messiah from escaping the physical world and returning to the void. Because Sulfur needs Mercury, he needs that spirit so that it can combine with the remaining element, salt, meaning the body, and thereby allow him to reach the state of wholeness he craves. Messiah's attempt to return to the sacred realm unintentionally stems from a form of selfishness. It goes against the original ideal of the Supreme God, to create a savior with a human origin, so that this very being could guide humanity back to its source of light. Therefore, he certainly would not allow that to happen easily. Perhaps he was there in the form of the god of destruction, nurturing the sun god. He was also there in the role of the 12th disciple, ensuring that the event of ascension would take place. And he was there once again, witnessing the moment his child, who was also humanity's final hope, was split in two and collapsed just before the final step toward wholeness. However, please keep in mind that the true identity of Black Kalev remains uncertain, and what I have presented above is still only the theory that I personally find most reasonable. Whether it is right or wrong, we cannot deny that Black Kalev was an extremely important factor in the event through which Messiah ascended and became Almer. He did not merely contribute to that event. He also witnessed the entire process of Almer splitting himself into two halves at Mahabri. Therefore, if we want to understand what truly happened to Almer and why Sulfur, the part that appeared to hold dominance within him at that moment, was ultimately cast down into the sulfur pits by the other half, we need to return to what Black Kalev saw with his own eyes during those final moments.
I stood next to your celebrated Christ, Almer the Ascended One, as he carved his idol. To condense his true essence, he carved that macabre being from the depths of his subconsciousness, to confront his shadow, the unknowable, the imperfection that obstructed his pursuits of absolution. As one, the Ascended One became two. That was when humanity finally reached the heights it had always strived for. Only it was not two gods that the mankind yearned for. Now was it? If the other one had been dug deep within Almer's subconsciousness, it had to be sent back just as deep, so it wouldn't obstruct the newfound order. Cast away, so the true absolution could be reached. Cast away deep, all the way down to the sulfuric pits. But which one was it that got cast away? The conscious or the subconscious of the Ascended One? If you continue carving idols, big enough to rival the old world order, you won't know which side of you prevails. It could just as well be you who gets squashed as your shadow runs loose.
There is no light without it casting a shadow. Good on one hand and evil on the other. Good can come from bad places, just as bad can come from the good. A constant struggle. For a very long time, I've questioned and reflected on what Black Kalev says about consciousness, the subconscious, the shadow, and imperfection. As I said at the beginning of the video, Almer's ascension and the birth of the Sulfur God weren't inspired solely by religion or theology. They were also strongly influenced by psychology and alchemy. And to fully understand what Black Kalev is referring to, we need to examine one of the most important sources of inspiration behind it, the psychology of Carl Jung. Before going deeper into this subject, I need to make it clear that I'm not an expert, nor do I have specialized knowledge in this area. Everything I'm about to share comes from my own research, condensed into simpler language to help you understand it as easily as possible. So please approach this section with an open mind, as a discussion we can explore together. Okay, let's begin. Carl Jung's psychology revolves around a very important concept called individuation. Individuation is the process through which a person reaches a whole, authentic, and unique state of the self by unifying the different parts within themselves: ego and shadow, consciousness and unconscious. Put simply, individuation describes the process through which a person reaches the highest state of awakening by unifying every aspect within themselves. Among these, the most important are consciousness and the unconscious. Notably, Carl Jung once said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. To achieve individuation, you must confront and accept your own shadow. You must also undergo a kind of sacrifice, the sacrifice of the illusion of your own perfection. In other words, there is no birth without death. Now, let's return to the story of Almer. Clearly, his ascension and movement toward wholeness can be read as a metaphor for the process of individuation. Almer himself also recognized the conflicting aspects within him: light and darkness, good and evil, a collective goal, and a selfish personal desire. Almer decides to carve out a macabre being, something buried deep within the subconscious, in order to confront his own shadow. The imperfection obstructing his pursuit of absolute perfection serves as a metaphor for the need to confront the darkness within oneself in order to reach a complete state of enlightenment. However, instead of integrating and accepting the darkness within him, Almer made the wrong decision. Not only did he refuse to sacrifice the illusion of his own perfection and truly reconcile with his shadow, but he also chose to reject that darkness by attempting to bury it deep within the sulfur pits. But here is the twist. By carving idols of himself, even an idol representing his dark side, and giving that part a concrete form, Almer unintentionally allowed the shadow within his subconscious to rise with even greater power until it could no longer be controlled. From Black Caleb's ambiguous words, I believe you already know what was sealed inside the evil idol by the other half, and then cast into that deep sulfuric pit. The conscious part, the soul of Ammon, which would later become Sulfur God. And the part that remained was, ironically, the very shadow Sulfur had once buried deep within the subconscious, the spirit of Messiah, now transformed into another god named Algiz. Let's pause here for a moment. The fact that Messiah was seen by Sulfur as the shadow doesn't mean that Messiah was entirely wicked or evil. According to Jung, the shadow isn't simply evil. It consists of the aspects of themselves that people want to hide, refuse to acknowledge, or don't want to reveal. It can include negative qualities, but it can also contain positive ones. Therefore, the fact that Messiah, or the human part of Almer, was pushed into the unconscious simply means that these were the aspects Almer considered incompatible with his current divine state. They could include forgiveness, mercy, weakness, and even the personal selfishness we analyzed earlier. One reason I believe Sulfur God is the soul of Ammon sealed within the sulfur pits lies in one of Hugo's texts about Mahabre. In it, Hugo describes the city and its statues as waiting for their king to return. He also mentions a sulfur sun rising from beneath the earth, one unlike the sun described in earlier texts. About Mahabra, a new sun, an almost perfect copy. Think about it. The sun god disappeared to give birth to Almer. After that, Almer was split in two. One half became Sulfur, the distorted soul of the sun god cast into the sulfur pits. The other became Algiz, the spirit of Messiah, the part associated with protection and salvation. So doesn't the birth of Sulfur, along with his description as a different yet almost perfect copy of the former sun, make a great deal of sense? Not to mention that the Sulfur God clearly possesses aspects of blood, fire, and violence, the very qualities we know were absorbed by Ammon's seed after it was influenced by Grogoroth. In my view, this is one of the most important pieces of evidence confirming the relationship between the sun god and the sulfur god. The fact that the sulfur god's sigil is placed immediately after Ammon's symbol can be understood to mean that the sulfur god was born from what remained of Ammon, the sun god, after he was cast into the sulfur pits. Likewise, the fact that Algiz's sigil appears immediately after that of the sulfur god can be understood as representing his opposing aspect, positioned according to the clock's principle of symmetry and opposition. The opposition between Algiz and the sulfur god is also expressed very cleverly through the motif of the eye. Do you remember when I said that the eye is a symbol of illumination and enlightenment? The fact that the Sulfur God is called the One-Eyed God, while his original form depicted in the Church of Almer has both eyes, leads us to a noteworthy conclusion. The eyes were divided when Almer split himself in two. In other words, calling the Sulfur God the One-Eyed God implicitly suggests that he is no longer a whole being. This may also explain the Sulfur God's weakened state in the second game, where he seems unable to intervene directly in the real world or grant blessings to his followers as other gods do. He can operate only in hidden ways, through sacrificial rituals, cultists, and those who continue to worship him. This is because half of the Sulfur God's divinity was taken from him before he was sealed deep within the sulfur pits for thousands of years following his separation. To further support this argument, the corpse buried in the tomb of the gods at Mahabre, which fans have long believed belongs to Almer, is also missing one eye. This suggests that the remains may not have belonged to the complete Almer in the first place. In my view, they belong to Algiz, the one who possesses the remaining eye. I'll explain later why Algiz's corpse appears there, but I'm fairly confident in this line of theory. Return to the Sulfur God and the motif of the eyes. It seems that Sulfur God is trying to restore his left eye through blood rituals. This is shown very clearly in the story of Dawn, one of the 14 contestants in the Festival of Termina. The festival was originally created by the moon god Rare, but was later exploited by the Sulfur God to recruit followers and turn it into a massacre intended to offer the participants' souls to the One-Eyed God. The goal is singular: to restore the Sulfur God's power. From there, his followers hope to help their master break free from his current chains and attain the freedom they have always desired. Although, yes, the method is exceptionally violent. I won't go into Dawn's lore in too much detail in this video. You can rewatch my analysis of the Festival of Termina and Pocket Cat's lore to learn more. For now, we'll move through this part quickly. Dawn lost his entire family, as well as the person he loved most, in a blood ritual connected to a mysterious god, whom we later learn is the Sulfur God. Dawn tried to save the person he loved in every possible way. This included performing the ritual and sacrificing important parts of himself in an attempt to save her life. But it didn't work. The price he paid was his left eye. The fact that Dawn lost his left eye during the ritual suggests that the Sulfur God is especially interested in the exchange of eyes, particularly the left eye, the very thing this god still lacks. This means the Sulfur God may be struggling to restore and reclaim everything that once belonged to him: souls, eyes, worship, and the entire religious system originally built to revere him. We can see the extent of the Sulfur God's influence in the second game, especially in the Church of Almer. On the surface, this church was originally built to worship the Ascended One, but when we descend into its blood-soaked basement, we encounter the altar of the One God, where a statue stands that the faithful believe depicts Almer. In truth, however, it may be an image of the Sulfur God, or more precisely, an image of Almer before he was split into two halves. Even the name Altar of the One God seems to imply that this is the accepted image of the One God. While Marina comments only vaguely that it is a statue of Almer, or at least one depiction of this god, Osa states it more clearly. This is a distorted image of him. Osa also mentions that he cannot feel Almer's presence within the church. The decrepit priests of Prehevel are performing blood rituals for something far more evil. And of course, there is only one answer: the Sulfur God. Because the Sulfur God and this version of Almer were once the same being, it is easy to understand why the priests and followers cannot tell the difference. They are gradually being corrupted by the Sulfur God while still believing that they are serving Almer. This is what leads to the series of bloody sacrificial rituals taking place beneath the Church of Almer, or more accurately, beneath a church devoted to the earlier form of the Sulfur God. That said, the Sulfur God is only returning to the very place where he was once worshipped. Although the aspect this god represents has changed greatly, and although the way he influences humanity has become far more violent and distorted, the goal of the Sun God, or the Sulfur God, appears to remain unchanged, helping humanity achieve freedom. The only difference is, when he was still the Sun God, he remained close to humanity, guiding it in a harsh and somewhat cruel but still orderly way. After becoming Sulfur, he began guiding humanity toward freedom through blood and chaos. Osa once mentioned that, in his homeland, people call Almer a fool who tried to fly too close to the sun in humanity's endless pursuit. And the sun, as Osa describes it, was harsh, cruel, and uncomfortably close. This detail may imply two things. First, Almer, or more precisely, the human part of him, Messiah, made a mistake by pursuing a form of perfection similar to that of the sun god. Because he flew too close to the sun, his wings were burned away, allowing the soul of Ammon to overwhelm his human side and turn him into a second sun god, a cruel and harsh deity, uncomfortably close to humanity. Second, this may also imply certain aspects of Ammon, the sun god, who is described in other texts as constantly watching humanity's every movement from an uncomfortably close distance, even understanding the species' deepest desires and lustful thoughts. Alternatively, the sun here may not refer directly to Ammon. It may instead point toward another, more omnipotent god, the supreme god, the ancient sun god, the many-eyed, all-knowing entity that has always been present, observing humanity and understanding even its deepest desires. One detail I still cannot clearly explain is that many descriptions of the sun god somehow overlap with those of the moon god. The moon god, who is described as a god of trickery, has also observed humanity since its earliest steps. He too sees through humanity's darkest thoughts. And in a highly ambiguous way, he is repeatedly tied to the sun in stories and writings about him. In Egyptian mythology, Amun, the king of the gods, is merged with Ra, or Re, a name pronounced somewhat similarly to Rare, the moon god in Fear and Hunger. This seems to suggest some degree of blending between the two entities. The image of the moon god in the Skin Bible also has a design quite similar to the alchemical symbol that combines the sun and the moon, making the boundary between these two gods extremely vague and difficult to explain. If you have an interesting theory about this, let me know in the comments. Personally, I don't really believe that Amun and Rare merged into a single being. Perhaps this is simply a case of different inspirations being blended together during the developer's creative process. The only thing I can confidently analyze at this point is the meaning of the sun and moon in alchemy, and how it relates to the sulfur god and algiz. In alchemy, the sun represents gold, the masculine principle, heat, the soul, sulfur, daytime, and active consciousness. The moon, often depicted as a crescent on the left, represents silver, the feminine principle, coolness, spirit, Mercury, nighttime, and the passive subconscious. This description almost perfectly matches sulfur and algiz. Sulfur represents the soul, fire, and active consciousness. Algiz represents the opposing aspect, spirit, Mercury, and the subconscious. When these two images appear together, often with the moon embracing the sun, they symbolize the state of conjunction, meaning union. This is the process of achieving perfect balance between consciousness and the subconscious, heat and cold, masculine and feminine, active and passive, sulfur and mercury. This union creates a legendary androgynous being called the rebus, one of the most important symbols of the final stage in the alchemical journey towards spiritual and material perfection. And this overlaps in a surprisingly direct way with Carl Jung's concept of individuation, the union of consciousness and the unconscious in order to reach the highest state of enlightenment. This may also explain why the symbols of sulfur and algiz are placed between Amun, the sun god, and Rare, the moon god. I mention the relationship between Rare and Amun, or more precisely, the sulfur god in his current form, because the festival of Termina is organized by Rare, yet the sulfur god has a very clear presence within it. For a long time, I believed that the sulfur god and his followers were able to infiltrate and exploit the moon god's festival of Termina, because Rare no longer truly existed in the real world. However, as I mentioned in my video about Termina, Rare is still capable of consciously influencing events in the real world, including the festival itself. The clearest evidence is that he made a great effort to prevent the birth of the god of fear and hunger in the first game, as well as Logic, the machine god, during the Termina event in Prehevel. I once proposed that Rare may have been fully aware of the sulfur god's presence, but chose not to stop him. This is because the moon god's greatest goal is to prevent humanity from producing new ascended gods, entities capable of standing on the same level as beings like him, meaning the old gods. Meanwhile, the sulfur god was originally placed very close to, and perhaps even on the same level as, the old gods. Therefore, Rare may not have intervened when the one-eyed god exploited both his followers and the festival of Termina to restore his power. All things considered, this argument is not entirely baseless. However, in my view, it is still incomplete, and the ambiguous relationship between the moon god and the sun god may be the real key to the answer. The sulfur god is another version of the sun god. Therefore, the fact that Rare's followers turned to the sulfur god while still being able to use the moon god's remaining power may have been part of Rare's intention from the very beginning. Put simply, Rare may be creating the conditions for the sun god, or, at this point, the sulfur god, to restore his power and return to the ranks of the gods. And if this is true, it explains many things. First, it explains why the sulfur god can appear and quietly exert influence in Prehevel through Rare's blood moon event. Second, it explains why Perkele, a follower who originally served the moon god, mysteriously turned to the sulfur god. Third, it explains why the sulfur god can harvest souls from the festival of Termina, while Rare shows almost no clear sign of intervention. And finally, the most revealing detail, it explains why the sulfur god is the god behind Dawn's tragedy, setting off a chain of events that brings him to Prehevel, only for him to later be possessed in both soul and body by Pocket Cat, whom we know to be a loyal servant of the moon god. It resembles a mutually beneficial relationship between the two gods. The moon god creates the conditions for the sulfur god to restore his original power through the festival of Termina and those who follow him. In return, the sulfur god helps the moon god deal with the problem he fears most: humans with the potential to evolve into new gods equal to the old gods. At the same time, he creates the conditions for the moon god's most loyal servants to continue existing in the real world. All things considered, the sulfur god is also the one who understands better than anyone else the price that must be paid when divine power is given to humanity. Speaking of the sulfur god's goal, beyond harvesting souls to escape his seal and restore his full power, This entity seems never to have forgotten the ultimate purpose he once held in the form of the Sun God, helping humanity attain freedom. However, as mentioned earlier, after thousands of years imprisoned and burned in the depths of the sulfuric abyss, the Sulfur God has been consumed by immeasurable hatred, and that hatred has corrupted his original goal. Instead of unifying humanity and guiding it toward enlightenment, allowing the human spirit to reach a higher reality, the Sulfur God now helps humanity attain what he calls freedom through blood and violence. The followers of the Sulfur God undergo a process that draws out the darkest and most primal parts of human nature: desire, craving, instinct, and violence. Afterward, they are thrown directly into a sulfur cage, where they experience the death of both soul and body, the two shells or chains that imprison them. That process is described as summer and winter occurring at the same time. The sun scorches the skin from the outside, while bone-chilling currents of cold rise from within. Only by surviving and rising from that dark pit do they truly become followers of the cult of Sulfur God and attain what is called freedom. Freedom from morality, freedom from law, freedom from the manipulation of the new gods, who use power inherited from the old gods to guide humanity along the path they have chosen. However, it must be emphasized that this is clearly not true freedom. It is like helping humanity escape one cage only to enter a larger one. They reach a place where they are free within chaos, yet that very chaos remains under the control of Sulfur God. In my view, the Sulfur God simply stimulates the darkest aspects within his victims, burns their bodies and souls, and then allows them to be completely consumed by darkness, much like the way this God himself was born. Through that process, the old self is destroyed, transforming them into beings of pure violence, blood, and evil. The clearest examples are Needles and Stitches, formerly known in their human lives as Don's father-in-law and wife, both of whom died in the sacrificial ritual of Sulfur God. If the followers of the old gods usually represent certain aspects of their master's power, then the same is also true of Sulfur. Followers of Sylvian are often connected to rituals of fertility, sex, and love. Followers of Grogaroth are associated with blood, violence, and sacrifice. Followers of the Moon God are linked to the mind, deception, and manipulation. As for Sulfur, his power appears to be tied to the soul, hatred, and death. And to discuss the Sulfur God's power in greater depth, we need to examine the place where Sulfur God is said to have been sealed and cast down, the sulfur pits. In ancient religious texts, especially the Bible, hell is often described as a burning lake of fire and brimstone. But in Dante's Divine Comedy, the center of hell, where the most sinful souls are imprisoned, is an eternal frozen lake of absolute cold. Real sulfur flames also have a distinctive blue color, evoking both burning heat and cold at the same time. And this fits very well with the way the sulfur pits are described: burning from the outside and freezing from within. Sulfur is also especially connected to the souls of the dead. According to many accounts of paranormal phenomena, when a spirit or underworld entity appears, the temperature of the room often drops suddenly, creating chilling cold spots. This drop in temperature is frequently accompanied by the smell of sulfur in the air. This is also the odor produced when organic matter, such as animal or plant remains, decomposes. Therefore, in many folk and religious traditions, demons and evil spirits, which represent death and decay, are often associated with the smell of sulfur. Many records from the Middle Ages also claim that after exorcisms, when an evil spirit was driven back to hell, the room would be left filled with frightening gray smoke and the strong smell of rotten eggs or sulfur. In some stories about Satan in particular, the smell of sulfur continues to linger in the air even after he disappears. Considering the connection between Sulfur God and Almer, a character modeled very closely after Jesus, the Sulfur God may clearly be inspired in part by Satan. Similarly, the sulfur pits can be understood as a symbolic representation of hell. Hints of Sulfur God are also subtly planted throughout several special areas in the game. One example is the Foundations of Decay, where a statue that seemingly belongs to an evil god appears, surrounded by a mountain of corpses left behind by some form of sacrificial ritual, along with the strong, lingering smell of rotten eggs in the air. Even more notably, within Rare's dimension, the parallel reality created by Rare through the Golden Gate spell, a skill described as leading you away from madness and the false world, there is a hidden area bearing the symbol of the Sulfur God. This place also contains 2 of the 3 statues needed to unlock the path to the altar of the one God, the area where we know a statue of the Sulfur God stands, depicting him while he was still in human form. The appearance of Sulfur God's symbol within Rare's space once again strengthens the theory we just proposed, that Rare may be creating the conditions for Sulfur God to influence the real world. Another interesting detail, one that I have seen very few people mention, concerns the 3 key statues used to open the path to the altar of the one God. They stand atop statues depicting kneeling angels, fallen angels, and in the basement area, where the martyr statue bearing Rare's symbol is located, we also find 3 special summoning sigils belonging respectively to 3 of the 72 demons of Solomon: Crossel, Astaroth, and Valifor. All 3 have one thing in common. They are fallen angels who hold the title of Great Duke. They are powerful demons ranked below only the 9 demons who hold the title of King. And of course, above all of them stands Lucifer. Not only that, but all 3 are also masters who teach knowledge. Crossel and Astaroth teach the liberal sciences, such as philosophy and mathematics, while Valifor teaches traditional medicine and hidden tricks. The appearance of the summoning seals of these 3 demons in the underground basement of the Church of Almer remains a mystery. Perhaps they are connected to the dark sacrificial rituals performed by the priests there. And perhaps, during one such ritual, the priests accidentally summoned these demons, leading to their own deaths as well as the deaths of the sacrificial victims in the area. This may also be the cause behind the appearance of the Crimson Fathers, snail-like creatures incapable of speech, driven by an insatiable thirst for blood, and appearing only after a bloodbath or large-scale massacre, like snails emerging after rain. The Crimson Fathers seem to have a mysterious connection to Sulfur God, because they can project the image of the burning Sulfur God directly into the human mind. If we consider the Sulfur God to be another version of Satan or Lucifer, then perhaps Crossel, Astaroth, and Valifor were angels who once served beneath the Sulfur God when he was still in the form of the Sun God. And the fact that their summoning symbols are located within the Moon God's symbol may imply that the Moon God is connected to the ritual of summoning the demons who once served the Sulfur God back into the real world. Of course, it may carry an entirely different meaning that I still cannot clearly explain. I would genuinely like to hear your thoughts on this detail. Is it simply a piece of inspiration, or does it carry a deeper meaning? Let me know in the comments. I would also like to hear your theories about another question I still do not truly have an answer to. What exactly are the sulfur pits? As Perkel describes in an unused text, the Sulfur God is the only god left behind after the old gods departed. Therefore, he exists beyond the eternal cycle and outside the grand scheme of all things. So where exactly are the sulfur pits? Are they simply a symbolic representation of hell? Are they the void? Or are they a deeper layer located within the physical world itself? After all the analysis above, my purpose is simply to show that the Sulfur God's power is tied to the soul, death, and hatred. And from an angel of light, the Sulfur God has now become an evil god, a demon lord ruling over hell, forever longing to reclaim his wings so that he can return to the sacred realm, the place he once ruled. So, we've explained the true origin of Ulmer and identified why he split himself into two halves. We've also examined the power the Sulfur God possesses, as well as the purpose behind his appearance in the Festival of Termina. We've gone through almost all the mysteries surrounding this god, but several questions remain unanswered. First, what is the true meaning behind the painting depicting the three versions of Ulmer in the church? Second, what is the origin of the corpse buried in the tomb of the gods at Mahabre? And third, how did Ulmer, or more precisely, his other half, mysteriously disappear? And why did that later lead to his order being overthrown by the Fellowship? If you've watched my video explaining alchemy in Fear and Hunger, you may already have part of the answer. However, as promised, I'll offer a more complete perspective on why alchemy is the key to explaining almost every mystery surrounding Ulmer. In alchemy, sulfur is one of the three elements of the Tria Prima, the foundational structure believed to make up all matter and life in the universe, alongside salt and mercury. Together, these three elements form the Tria Prima. Within this system, sulfur, meaning brimstone, represents the soul, the masculine principle, fiery energy, passion, and will. It is the force that drives development, creates the desire for change, and forms the burning flame within every being. Mercury, meaning quicksilver, represents spirit, the feminine principle, water energy, fluidity, and wisdom. It is the binding substance, serving as the intermediary that connects the soul, sulfur, with the body, salt. Salt represents earth energy, condensation, form, and stillness. It is the outer material shell that prevents the soul and spirit from dissipating, allowing all things to take physical form. The ultimate goal of alchemists is to create the Philosopher's Stone. This creation is seen as a symbol of perfection, immortality, and the ability to transform ordinary metals into gold. To achieve this, they must carry out three major steps. Separation, dividing a substance into its three original components, sulfur, mercury, and salt. Purification, element until it reaches absolute purity. Recombination, uniting them again in a perfect ratio in order to attain immortality or transform base metals into gold. This process is called the magnum opus, meaning the great work. It includes several stages corresponding to the colors they represent: nigredo, albedo, citrinitas, and rubedo. I won't go too deeply into each stage to avoid overwhelming you with too much information. You can revisit my alchemy video for a closer look. What I need you to understand here is, in my view, Ulmer's ascension is a metaphor for the magnum opus in alchemy. Put more simply, Ulmer's birth and ascension were part of a design created by the beings above, intended to transform him into a perfect philosopher's stone. The process unfolded like this. Ulmer was created from three elements: sulfur, the soul of Ammon; mercury, the spirit of Messiah; and salt, the body created by Vitruvia. After Ammon's soul was planted within Maria and Messiah was born, Ulmer existed in a primordial state similar to prima materia, or the black matter of alchemy. Messiah's execution and death on the cross represent the first stage of the great work, nigredo. This is the stage in which the black matter decomposes, releasing sulfur and mercury. In other words, Almer destroys his old bodily structure through death in order to release the soul and spirit imprisoned within it. This stage corresponds to the first painting on the right. The next event occurs when the soul of Amen and the spirit of Messiah return to true Mahabre. After 3 days, the body, having been purified and washed clean of impurities, turns silvery white. This stage represents albedo, meaning purification. The spirit, Mercury, and the body, Salt, temporarily reach a pure and untainted state. This marks resurrection, the washing away of sin and darkness. It explains why, after returning, Almer is described as having lost all the hair on his body and taken on an unusual white hue. This stage corresponds to the second painting on the left. Almer's return and the beginning of his path of vengeance represent citrinitas, meaning yellowing or awakening. This is the stage in which alchemists apply gentle heat, expose a substance to sunlight, or allow slow oxidation reactions to occur, causing the white solid to gradually turn lemon yellow or golden. This represents the awakening of solar energy, the masculine energy associated with sulfur. It marks the transition from moonlight, meaning silver, to sunlight, meaning gold, in preparation for the ultimate union. That is why Almer takes on a yellow tone. This stage corresponds to the third painting in the center. At this point, Almer is only one final step away from transforming himself into a perfect philosopher's stone, rubedo, meaning reddening or eternal recombination. This is the culmination of the great work. At this stage, all components of the tria prima, sulfur, mercury, and salt, are recombined after being purified. The substance turns blood red or a radiant crimson purple. As a result, the philosopher's stone is born in the form of a red stone. However, as you know, Almer failed at this stage. That is why the final painting, depicting Almer in the red color that symbolizes supreme perfection, is missing. As mentioned earlier, Carl Jung believed that the great work of alchemy could be understood as a metaphor for the process of individuation. In the language of alchemy, Almer's refusal to accept his own shadow, rejecting it instead of acknowledging and integrating it, can be understood as an attempt to remove one element from the foundational structure rather than combining all three. And the element he tried to remove, as we know, was Mercury, the spirit of Messiah, the human part he considered an imperfection after becoming a true God. Removing one element from this foundational structure is extremely dangerous. We already know the result, the collapse of Almer himself. The sulfur part, the soul of Ammon, was cast deep into the sulfur pits. Meanwhile, the mercury part, the spirit of Messiah, remained and combined with salt, the body of Almer, later becoming algiz. However, the absence of the soul element had an extremely serious consequence. The result was petrification and absolute stagnation. Sulfur possesses the properties of expansion, combustion, and volatility. When this expansive force is lost, the contracting, crystallizing, and immobile nature of salt becomes completely dominant. In alchemical theory, mercury serves as the intermediary, the bridge between the soul, sulfur, and the body, salt. But when sulfur disappears, mercury no longer has a purpose. The intellect and energetic flow of mercury are left connected only to an empty corpse, meaning salt. Put simply, algiz is imprisoned within his own petrified body. That is the answer to the giant, motionless, petrified corpse of Almer in the tomb of the gods at Mahabre. When we interact with the corpse, some in-game characters comment that it is still alive. But at this point, Almer is only a spirit imprisoned within a hardened body. That may also explain why, When necromancy is cast on Almer's corpse, only his penis rises. The true soul of Almer can no longer be summoned, so the only reaction that remains is a natural biological response from the body. By the time the events of Fear and Hunger 1 take place, Almer's body has completely decayed, leaving behind only a skeleton. This means that, after a long period of imprisonment, the spirit of Messiah was finally freed. And as we've established, Mercury is highly volatile, and I believe Messiah returned to the realm he had always longed to reach, the void. This explains why the other half of Almer, Algiz, mysteriously disappeared from the flow of history, and why Almer's presence is now only faint, responding solely through prayers and blessings from a very distant realm. It also explains the full significance of the paintings depicting him in his church. These final pieces of analysis bring together the hidden secrets surrounding the Sulfur God, the mysterious one-eyed god in the game. So, to end this video, I'll once again connect all the pieces into one complete picture, a story that, in my view, may reflect what truly happened. From the dawn of the universe, before humanity knew the names of the gods, before the first cities, religions, and kingdoms were built, the world of fear and hunger may have been ruled by powers far more ancient. At the very top, within the green depths of green hue, the realm of nothingness, there existed a supreme god, an omniscient and omnipotent entity. His existence was the source of light, order, and the all-seeing gaze that watched over every layer of reality. From that being, Amun, the sun god, was born. Amun was the first light, the king of Mahabharata, and the leader of the ancient gods. Together with 7 other old gods, he shaped the physical world, established its first laws, and ruled the universe during an age when humans still did not truly understand the nature of the powers governing their lives. In that age, the old gods were not merely separate divine individuals. They functioned as the principles that formed the world itself. By the will of Sylvian, the goddess of love and fertility, Vitruvia, a divine architect, designed humanity. Sylvian breathed life into that design, and the first human was born. But the design was not perfect. Sylvian's love for humanity was intense, but it was also blind. And although Vitruvia was a divine architect, she was still a lesser entity compared to the supreme powers. The flaw in her design caused humanity to become an imperfect species. Humans carried divine light within them, but they were also bound to the body. They had souls, but those souls were trapped in matter. They could reach toward a higher realm, yet they were pulled downward by desire, fear, hatred, and ignorance. Over time, humanity drifted further and further from its path. Humans could no longer hear the call of the higher layers of reality. They could no longer see the primordial light that once existed within them. Their spirits and souls were imprisoned by the body, by blood, by power, and by the ruling cycles of the new gods, those who considered themselves the pinnacle of humanity and constantly guided others according to an order they had deluded themselves into creating, causing humanity to sink even deeper into ignorance. The supreme god saw this, and he was not pleased. The old gods were ordered to withdraw from the material world and return to the void, true Mahabharata. They were no longer permitted to interfere directly with humanity's development. But before they fully departed, the Creator made a demand. Humanity needed a savior, not an old god imposing their will upon the world, but an entity with an origin rooted in humanity itself. Someone who could live in a human body, suffer like a human, die like a human, and thereby guide humanity back toward the light. So Amun volunteered to sacrifice himself. The sun god abandoned his throne in Mahabharata, He transformed himself into a seed of light, a divine soul prepared to be planted in the material world. But that light needed a body. After recognizing the flaw in her original design for humanity, Vitruvia created a new blueprint, a perfect human being. This would become the mold, the salt, the body capable of bearing Amon's divinity. But light and body alone were not enough. The seed still needed to be planted in the world. And so, for millennia, Amon's seed was incubated within the body of Grogoroth, the god of destruction. That process left an indelible stain upon the light of the sun god, a stain of blood, violence, and destruction. Finally, the seed was planted within a virgin woman named Maria, and so Messiah was born. On the surface, Messiah was human. He was born into the material world, grew up among humanity, preached unity, and called different religions and systems of thought back under one shared house. He carried the image of a savior, gathered 12 apostles, and performed miracles reminiscent of Jesus, walking on water, turning water into wine, multiplying bread, and opening spatial gates. All of these powers came from what slept deep within his body, the soul of Amon, the sun god. Messiah was a vessel, a container for a divine seed waiting for the day it would sprout. And for that seed to awaken, Messiah had to die. Black Kalev, the 12th apostle, understood this clearly. The one who had accompanied Messiah from the beginning of his journey accepted the sin of becoming the betrayer. Standing apart from the remaining 11 apostles, Black Kalev was the only one who understood that Messiah's death on the cross had to happen. And so, Messiah was arrested, crucified, and killed. At that moment, the human body was destroyed. The old structure dissolved. The soul of Amon and the spirit of Messiah were released from the prison of matter and returned to Mahabra. For 3 days and 3 nights, in the city of the gods, the soul of Amon, the spirit of Messiah, and the body prepared by Vitruvia underwent a process of transformation. The old body was purified. Almer was born. The soul of Amon began to awaken. The light of the sun began to rise. Almer returned to the world as a new sun entering human history. But that sun was no longer pure. Almer returned, yet the one who came back was no longer the merciful Messiah he had once been. He gathered the remaining 11 apostles. He sought out the kings and sultans who had executed him and destroyed the new order and built another in its place. But that order was not truly new. It was the old order reborn in another form. A new old order, an attempt to pull humanity back onto the path of the old gods, but through blood and hatred. Deep within him, Messiah still knew this was wrong. That human part still remembered salvation, protection, forgiveness, and light. But the awakened Amun, the solar soul stained by Grogoroth, believed that humanity could be saved only through domination, through blood, through burning away the old order to build a new one. Almer was torn in two from within. One side wanted to save humanity. The other wanted to force humanity to be saved. One side wanted to return to the sacred realm. The other wanted to complete the mission through absolute power. Almer recognized the imperfection within himself. He knew he was incomplete. He knew his ascension was missing its final step. He knew he had not reached harmony, the state in which soul, spirit, and body had to become one in order to achieve wholeness. But instead of accepting all 3 parts of himself, he chose to separate them. Almer carved idols of himself. He drew from deep within his subconscious an entity condensed from his true essence. He wanted to confront his shadow, the human part, the imperfection he believed was obstructing his path toward absolute absolution. Yet the very act of giving that shadow a form allowed it to rise. And then Almer was split in 2. One half was Sulfur, the soul of Ammon. The other half was Algiz, the spirit of Messiah. This is where the reversal happened. Algiz took on the image of the Savior. Sulfur was defeated, sealed, cast down into the depths of the sulfur pits. From that point onward, the Sulfur God was born. But he had only one eye, because the whole being had been divided in two. One eye belonged to Sulfur, the other belonged to the corpse, or the Algiz half, left behind in the tomb of Mahabra. Algiz was imprisoned within his own body. Then time passed. That body decayed. The spirit of Messiah was finally freed from that prison. He returned to the realm he had always longed for, the void, a layer of reality beyond the material world. That is why Almer disappeared from history, not because he died in the usual sense, but because the complete Almer was never truly finished. The Sulfur half was buried within the sulfur pits. The Messiah half returned to the void. The body was left behind in Mahabur, and humanity was left worshipping only fragments. The great work had failed, and from that failure, two religions quietly split apart. On the surface, humanity worshipped Almer as the Ascended One, the Savior, the Protector, the God of unity. But beneath the church, amid the smell of sulfur and the altars of sacrifice, the remaining half of Almer was also worshipped. The decrepit priests no longer worshipped the Savior above. They spilled blood for the entity burning beneath the earth. They called it doctrine, blessing, the gospel of agony. From abyss, the Sulfur God, trying to reclaim everything that once belonged to him, the eyes, the souls, the worship, and the power he lost. To accomplish this, he needed a larger gate, the Festival of Termina. The festival belonged to Rare, the moon god, a god of moonlight, illusion, deception, and observation. Rare may have allowed him to enter the festival. Rare provides the stage, the blood moon, distorted space, and a festival in which humans are driven into violence and despair. Sulfur provides the result. Souls are harvested, those with the potential for ascension are eliminated, and the power of the one-eyed God is gradually restored. Rare's followers are drawn into Sulfur's purpose. The festival becomes a place where both gods benefit from humanity's collapse. Almer failed because he was blind in his pursuit of perfection, because he tried to reject the darkness. Light cannot exist without shadow. Light and darkness always walk side by side, like an immutable law of the universe. That's the whole story. The concept of perfection cannot exist without the concept of imperfection. Through the story of the Sulfur God, I hope you can accept the imperfections and even the mistaken judgments in this video as part of the law of incompleteness. That imperfect things are precisely what create beauty. And our true beauty does not lie in perfection, but in the flaws that make us more human than ever.